Let's talk about the same example that we went over in class on Thursday. Let's see, that was November 5th. So the idea was to think about pollution from a car manufacturing plant. And I think there was some confusion about the idea that somebody could be made better off without somebody else being made worse off, and how that related to the people who suffered from the pollution wanting to pay the factory to essentially produce less. So I want to make that a little more clear. So let's think about the incentives for all the people involved in this. So there are three groups of people involved. There are the producers, there are the consumers, and then who's the other group? Think about it. Remember that the scenario is we have this factory that's producing cars and selling them to people, and what's harming other people? It's the pollution, and so the other group of people are the people who live nearby. How nearby depends on what kind of pollution it is, right? I somehow just forgot how many O's there are in neighbors. I'm still not confident about that. That's okay. So producers, consumers, neighbors. And, well, what do we want to do with each of these? So what we want to do is think about their marginal benefit of making a car or buying a car or whatever happens when there's another car sold, their marginal cost. Marginal benefit, marginal cost, marginal benefit, marginal cost for each of them. So we've also said before, remember, that the demand curve tells us the marginal benefit, right? And the supply curve tells us the marginal cost. So then why is it that I have all these other marginal benefits and marginal costs? Well, the supply curve tells us the marginal cost of producing this good, and the demand curve tells us the marginal benefit to the consumers. So that is here's that marginal cost of producing and the marginal benefit to consumers. So these are the two pieces of information that show up as supply and demand. But there are four other things in this diagram that could be useful. So the marginal benefit to consumers, to producers, that one might be a little hard to think about. But let's look at what the price is. So right now, in a free market, here will be the price. Okay, so the marginal benefit to the producers is the price. Well, why is that? So think about what the producer gains by making this good and selling it. What they gain is whatever people pay them for that good. So that's the price. Okay? And the marginal cost to producers, we already know, is the height of the supply curve. So this is height of supply curve, right? And we know that the marginal benefit to the consumers is the height of the demand curve. Oops. And, well, what's the marginal cost for the consumers? Well, what they have to pay for that final unit is the price, and that's what it costs them. It might also cost them in terms of going to a store to buy something. These are cars. Negotiating and doing research. All of those things are costly, but let's ignore those for a moment and just think about how much they pay, the monetary price. So we've got the marginal costs and the marginal benefits for them. So notice that the reason why we just talk about the supply curve being the marginal cost and the demand curve being the marginal benefit is that the price is the same, is also showing up in each of these cases. So basically what we have is that a demand curve equates the marginal benefit to the price. So it's not necessarily this specific price, but suppose the price was up here. Well, we'd go over to the demand curve and we'd say, here's the marginal benefit. Here's a price, here's the marginal benefit, and they're equal at this quantity. So basically, the demand curve tells us how the consumers balance the costs that they face, which are prices, against the benefits that they get from those goods. And the supply curve tells us the same thing. It costs the firm this much to produce this quantity, and so if they're balancing their costs against their benefits, they will need to be paid at least this amount to sell this quantity. So actually, the supply curve already includes producers balancing their benefits against their costs. And the demand curve already includes buyers balancing their benefits against their costs. And then all that's left over is balancing the benefits and costs of the producers against the benefits and costs for the consumers. And because along the demand curve, both of these are equal, meaning they are willing to pay up to what they get in benefit, so those are equal along the demand curve. And the supply curve is where the costs equal the price that they face. And so because, remember, they're willing to accept at least or no less than their costs, so those are equal right here. The price equals the marginal cost. So these are equal for the producers. And this point of equilibrium is where these things, which are equal along the supply curve, and these things, which are equal along the demand curve, are all equal to each other. So it's really these four things that are all equal at this equilibrium point. Okay, so that's kind of cool, I think. You might not think so, but I like it a lot. Okay, so this point is special. This is the equilibrium point in the market. But then we say, well, there's this problem. The problem is that there are people who are affected by this market but don't have any influence on the choices that are made within that market. And we say, well, the problem here is that there is this external cost of producing cars, which we call pollution. And let's say that it is always $100. There's the external cost of $100. And so then we have to sort of step back and think, well, what exactly is the problem here? And I told you that the problem is that somebody could be made better off without somebody else being made worse off. There are other problems too, like you might be concerned about, well, maybe you would say that the people who live in this neighborhood have a right to not live in pollution. Okay, so that's a claim that I try to not make when I'm teaching, because it's what we call a normative claim about what should be rather than what is. And that's up to you to decide what should be, not up to me. Okay, so I would guess that a lot of people would have that view, but not necessarily everyone. So then why is it that I go on to talk about the idea that these people who are hurt by the pollution are the ones who then have to go and pay for it? Well, it's not that they're the ones who have to. It's that thinking about how much they would be willing to pay for this helps us to make sense of how costly it is and what would be a better outcome. Okay, so let's imagine that we can know the exact numbers for some of these things. So let's take, here's 1, 2, 3, 4. I didn't make my graph right. Okay. I'm going to do this. We're just going to go with 4 here. So there's 2, 3, 1. I probably should have lined it up with the grid. Sorry about that. And let's put in numbers here. So I'm going to make this one. We're going to need some blue added to this. Okay. And we need the prices now. Okay, so the marginal cost over here is going to be, let's just do a simple one, 1,000. So I'm going to do these in thousands over here on the side. These are cheap cars, I guess. So this is 2,000, 3,000, and this P is now going to become 4,000. Okay. 4,000. And then we'll go up above and we'll look at the marginal values. Well, the marginal value of the fourth one for the consumer is the height of the demand curve at 4, which is just 4,000. Okay, so this would be the marginal benefit to the consumer of that fourth car is $4,000. Well, if we're only getting 4 cars and we lose one of them, if we lose the ability to buy that fourth car, well, that third car is more valuable than the fourth car because it will get used for more important things. So we can look back here again and say, okay, let's go up to here. Let's say this is 5, just simple values. Go straight up to here, 6, and let's say this one is 7 for one car. So remember, the marginal values fall as we move to the right. Okay, so I'm actually going to write all these out. So for the I didn't do this quite well enough. I'm going to see if I can... Oh, that doesn't work. That's weird. Well, that's okay. So I'm going to rewrite this table. So just know that this part is kind of separate. So I need the quantity. I need the marginal benefit. And the marginal cost for producers. And I need the marginal benefit and the marginal cost for consumers. And I need the marginal benefit and the marginal cost for the people who are not allowed to participate. Well, they're allowed to, they just aren't the consumers and the producers. So for them to participate, there has to be something extra going on. Okay? So I'll call them the neighbors again. Now, we want 1, 2, 3, 4. And we could go up to 5 if we wanted to, but we don't really need to. Well, the marginal benefit to producers, let's just talk about the marginal costs. So we know it cost them 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. And what's the marginal benefit to consumers? Well, we have 7, 6, 5, 4. Okay. And let's think about the marginal costs for the neighbors. Their marginal benefit from this is going to be 0 across the board because they don't really benefit from the cars. They're not getting the car. They're not being paid for the car. All they're doing is bearing some pollution costs. Okay? So the first car, let's suppose that every car produces the same amount of pollution, which has the same effect on everyone. So that's 0.1 in terms of thousands of dollars, or I could add zeros to these, which may be easier to look at. And what does this mean? Okay, so how much? Let's assume instead that it's 1,000 because that makes it easier to make this work. I probably didn't pick the best numbers. The problem here is that the numbers for the consumers and the producers are really large, and the number for the neighbors is small, and so we would get small changes in the quantity that are beneficial, or sorry, not beneficial, but efficient, and so I need a larger effect on the neighbors in order to get an entire car's worth of efficient changes. All right, that'll become more clear in just a second. So we look at this and we say, well, what would the neighbors like to do? Suppose that they could make a contract with the factory to reduce their production of cars from 4 to 3. So if they do that, what's going to happen? Well, they are willing to pay the car manufacturer $1,000 to produce less, up to $1,000. And if the car manufacturer does produce one less car and gets $1,000 for it, well, what happens? Stop and think about it. So it's actually an easier way to think about this. Let's say instead, suppose that we have a law that says, suppose the neighbors all get together and make a law that says, for every car that this firm manufactures, they have to pay $1,000. So this is a tax, essentially. $1,000 tax on every car. Okay, so what would that mean? Well, it means that we're going to raise the costs of the firm. The same thing would be true if the neighbors paid the firm $1,000 to not make a car. So think about what that means. If they make the car, what are they giving up? It's the same thing as if they had a tax. So if they have a $1,000 tax, they're giving up that $1,000 to make a car. Now, if they're being paid by the neighbors $1,000 to not make a car, from their perspective, that's the same thing as giving up $1,000 if they make that car, because if they make that car, they won't be given that $1,000 by the neighbors. So it's exactly the same. Okay? And are the neighbors willing to pay them $1,000 to not make that car? Yes, they are. Okay, so what that means is that we have this, that this would shift the supply curve up. I don't want it in green. It would shift the supply curve up by exactly that $1,000 because it adds that on to the cost for the producers. It's a cost just like any other. So they have to give up money to employees to make a car. They have to give up money to whoever they're renting the land from. They have to give up money to their suppliers of metal, and they have to give up this payment from the neighbors if they make that car. So it raises their marginal costs. Okay? And so that's going to shift the supply curve up just like that, just like it would with a tax. Okay, so that's why we think of this as having the same effect as a tax. But it's just sort of a different way of thinking about the same policy. Okay, so I'm going to add more in just a moment, but I'll make a separate video for that.